welcome back to the Stratcom podcast. I am very proud to say that today we're joined by a guest who really should not need an introduction, Dr. Vairavīte Freiberga. Dr. Vairavīte Freiberga is the former president of the Club de Madrid and, of course, the former president of Latvia. She was instrumental in achieving Latvia's membership in the EU and NATO, and she was also the special envoy on UN reform. Madam President, thank you for joining us today.
Hello, Tom. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
I think it would be completely amiss not to take the opportunity to ask you about the ongoing tragic events in Ukraine, the ongoing Russian aggression. In your view, very broadly, has the Western response thus far been sufficiently united and robust?
I might judge it as surprisingly united and coordinated. One might have feared that it could be worse, although, of course, this united reaction does come a bit late in the game, but it's definitely there. If we compare the reaction after the occupation of Crimea and then following its annexation, there were, of course, protests and condemnations, but right now, it's of course a different situation. There's an ongoing human catastrophe. Civilians are being slaughtered by what is looking more and more as it's soon going to be carpet bombing of the cities of Ukraine. It's a crime against humanity. Blood is flowing as we talk. And faced with such an unprovoked, unmotivated, unacceptable action on the part of the Russian Federation, the outrage has been nearly universal. There are always exceptions to every rule, but there are surprisingly few exceptions to the condemnation of this absolutely unacceptable behavior on behalf of the Russian Federation. And I would say that adding insult to injury, there's not just the injury being done by the invasion of Ukraine's territory and by the killing of its soldiers, but so many civilians as well, driving over 1 million people so far into exile, with all that entails in human suffering. But there's also a denigration of the state and of its inhabitants. The Russians are adding, and President Putin and his entourage, he is adding insult to injury by denying the Ukrainian people the legitimacy of the state and of the government that they have elected. And that is, I think, a very deep and profound wound to their dignity and to their worth as human beings. I mean, they're being considered as somehow inferior beings because they haven't been, their governments haven't been following to the letter the dictates coming from Moscow. It's a scandalous situation, and I think many people, including myself, were hoping to the very last minute that the encirclement, that the military encirclement of Ukraine that was building up over quite a number of weeks would be just a warning sign, a show of force or whatever, done for, as it were, impressing the gallery, the public. That it should turn into bloodshed is a horrible shock to everybody, and many people across the world simply cannot believe how can this sort of thing be happening right in the heart of Europe in our day and age, when we had, all of us, I think so many of us at least, had hoped that Europe was beyond these internecine wars that had been tearing it up over the centuries.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I think a quite natural follow-up, a question that has been on everyone's mind is what the potential implications of the conflict could be for democracy. Of course, we've been amazed by the heroic resistance of both the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people in the face of, as you said, unprovoked aggression. Do you think this war could actually be a rallying call for the democratic world? Do you think it can galvanize Western publics, publics in the United States, in Europe, but also around the world, strengthen the resolve to protect democratic values, human rights, fundamental freedoms?
One can always hope that it will do so. The people who are against democracy for a variety of reasons are going to be difficult to convince and to have them change their minds. But I think that there are huge numbers of people who have not particularly thought much about what kind of regime they live under. They just take it for granted. I live in my country, and things are running their natural course, and people don't philosophize about whether they're living in a democratic regime or less democratic or what. They simply put up with it. The part that is worrisome is the propaganda. The propaganda war and the preparation for the war that President Putin has put in place in his own country. And I understand that there are booklets circulating among the populace which explain his aims in life, which are to recreate the great Russian nation that consists of Great Russia, which is what we normally consider Russia, White Russia, and Little Russia, that being Ukraine. And that this concept, which is I don't know, it's a 19th century Slavophile idea that you might know better when the idea was born, but it's a sort of romantic dream which is turning into a horrible reality nightmare by Putin insisting that the world has to bend according to his will. And I think that the excessive length of years that he has been in a position of power, the increasing suppression of any kind of opposition or even different opinion in his country, that he has successfully achieved. His muzzling of the media, the killing of journalists who disobey, investigative journalists, and so forth, the atmosphere of fear, and his increasingly Stalinist vocabulary in addressing the world and his nation. These are terrifying steps backward for a country that is, after all, a huge landmass and territory, a country that has a huge nuclear arsenal and has also an extremely large conventional military power. And to see so powerful a country having such bizarre, I mean, frankly, bizarre ideas and insisting on imposing them on the world is, as we see for the Ukrainians, it's hard to believe, but here they are. They're dying. They're being killed. Their buildings are being destroyed. The will of this man to impose his vision of the world is terrifying. And the worst part is that the West, or those who believe in democracy, have to throw up their arms and say, we cannot do anything, because if we do, it's going to be the Third World War, it's going to be a nuclear war, and we'll destroy the planet. But you see, if President Putin uses this argument, you do as I wish, or else there's going to be a nuclear war, then next thing you know, he'll be king of the world. I mean, if we will not at some point resist him and say enough is enough, here is the red line beyond which we will not accept that you go. This threat of nuclear warfare on his side, after all, could be countered by nuclear forces on the other side. And it seems like the man is absolutely not interested in what would happen to the planet should he unleash such weapons. That's scary. That's scary.
It's horrifying, truly. On the question of Russia's bizarre ambitions, as you said, ambitions that seem to be rooted in this 18th, 19th century restoration of imperial glory. If we look at Russia's justifications for invading, these claims of Kiev being run by a fascist junta, kind of completely baseless claims of genocide being committed in the Donbass, which were debunked effectively even prior to the invasion. A grim takeaway of this could be that dictators aren't even pretending anymore. So if we look at yesterday's UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russian aggression, actually 141 countries voted to condemn. So that's the vast majority of the world. And yet Putin seems to have gone ahead anyway. Do you think that this signals that we're kind of entering an era of naked power politics, where truth, morality have no effect, no importance?
It's very clear that people of President Putin's ilk have no sense of morality in a way that most people in the West would understand it. In other words, this sense of limits beyond which my wishes and my rights and my desires can go, considering that I respect also you and everybody else's rights in return. That sense of reciprocity of rights and wishes is totally lacking in his psyche. He's a man who believes in naked power. He believes on imposing his will, and he has the deepest contempt for those who actually hold views of respect towards others. It's I think in that he's no different from the gangsters who showed up after the collapse of the Soviet Union in all parts of the former Soviet Union, and who had a certain code of behavior among gangsters, the honor among thieves sort of thing, but who certainly thought that anybody who wasn't able to counter them with the same level of violence that they were ready to use was a weakling and didn't deserve any respect or any consideration.
As a former president, I would be interested in hearing your perspective on the role of leadership in this conflict. Of course, publicly, President Putin and President Zelensky have taken very different approaches. Putin seating himself at these suspiciously long tables to avoid any kind of human contact. Reports of him spending significant time in a bunker, sending out pre-recorded messages that are framed as live speeches, intimidating his Security Council in public, kind of to project a sense of invoking fear. By contrast, President Zelensky has been kind of in the heart of battle, speaking with his people openly, candidly, refusing the prospect of evacuation. What impact do you think these different approaches in leadership, approaches in communicating with the public, what impact do you think that can have on societal mood, on societal resilience? Or do you think this is actually overblown?
Oh, the difference is striking. It's absolutely striking. Vladimir Putin has been an operetta leader from the word go. In other words, he's acting in a way that you would in an operetta on a stage or a vaudeville stage, showing what an alpha male and what a real leader and what a real he-man is like. This business of parading around with a naked chest and supposedly fishing out Greek amphorae out of the Black Sea. He dives in, and 5 minutes later he comes out with an amphora, an antique amphora in each hand. Absolutely ridiculous stunts that he has been presenting over the years. The queen of the former queen of the Netherlands, now Princess Beatrix, on her state visit to Latvia, told me of her visit to the Kremlin when she as a monarch of her country, was there on a state visit, and was made to walk through endless corridors before she reached the throne of the ruler of the land. And she said, when I walked up to him, I said, well, Mr. Putin, I see that you have learned well the lessons that my ancestor William of Orange put in place 300 years ago on how to impress your visitors. In other words, the theatricality that was part of course, of the courts of monarchs, or indeed of the Catholic Church and of the Orthodox Church, the pomp and ceremony and impressiveness. Some of it is a legitimate part of, I think, of the, if you like, the signs of power in even in democracies or constitutional monarchies. But in Putin's case, he was really um, building up the picture of the masculine, the he-man who is a leader and who has to be obeyed, just like a gangster who has a gang in his power and who can punish by death anybody who disobeys him. That's precisely what he has been doing, punishing by death, assassination, or imprisonment, or various other forms of punishment, anybody who went against his wishes and desires. President Zelensky is a real leader, the real thing. There's nothing false about him. He's not, the French have a leader de pacotille, which means sort of a straw man, a cutout. Putin is a cutout of a leader. And President Zelensky is the real thing. He is a real leader by his conviction, by his moral stance, by his courage, by his words, and by his deeds. There's nothing false about him.
I would also like to ask about the role that symbols can play in a conflict like this. We have heard, we've been captivated by specific tales of heroic resistance on behalf of the Ukrainians in the face of aggression and even indiscriminate attacks on civilians. One episode that has particularly galvanized audiences, at least in Latvia, but I think beyond, is the Russian attack on Zmyny Island and the resistance of 13 Ukrainian sailors in the face of overwhelming force. Can you tell me more about the impact that legends and symbols can have in mobilizing society?
They have an enormous influence because they work on our emotions. But you see, commitment, true commitment, requires emotions. Just cold rationality in terms of what is the right thing to do or what is the lawful thing to do has never moved any country or nation forward unless the people had, in parallel with it, or together, melded with intellectual understanding, an emotional conviction straight from the heart. In other words, the brain and the heart have to work together. And modern science has also proven that it is so. And these sacrifices, people will engage in them under great stress because they realize it's an existential question. And you see, people will value their dignity as human beings, or in this case, as Ukrainians and as sailors, or whatever else their position might be. If their dignity, their human dignity, is being attacked, they are ready to give up their life for it. And many people are often, actually, in the Western world, because things have been so quiet and so comfortable for so long, in many ways, it's a terrible thing to say, but the lack of serious threats has made many people sort of feeling cut loose from any kind of aim and commitment in their life. They feel adrift. They do not know what to commit to. They might start using drugs to get somehow, to get stronger emotions and stronger feelings because they feel that their life is empty and flat. And in a situation that demands the utmost from you, people are ready to overcome their instinctive fears, and to work in for a principle. And I think this, in many ways, has been the movement that also led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. That feeling that there comes a point where I am not ready to accept this system, which is trampling my dignity as a human being. And I absolutely feel that the time has come for a change, and I'm ready to give my life for it. And the Ukrainians are being told that their country is nothing, that their nation is nothing, that they are nothing. Well, yes, they are revolting against it because it's an attack on their dignity. And we also, I think the world sympathizes with that, because uh, the more they resist, the more the world respects and admires their ability to put principle above practicality and even life itself. Yeah, I personally find it an admirable thing, because otherwise, if people take the easiest path and renounce all ideals and all principles, I think the society that results from it is not a very desirable one.
The Ukrainian people are certainly showing that they're hell-bent on pursuing change, on joining the European community of nations and of values. But do you think that this war, perhaps just as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in '79, do you think this war could be catalyst for any kind of shift within Russia, perhaps sparking any kind of pro-democratic traction? We cannot ignore that despite the Putin regime's attempt to kind of insulate Russia's information space and shut down remaining opposition media, there are meaningful protests within Russia against the aggression. I believe there were protests in more than 48 cities, and Russian security services have been forced to arrest thousands of people for protesting. Do you think that there is any prospect for pro-democratic movement in Russia?
Until now, I was rather skeptical about the chances of Russia changing the population as such significantly within the foreseeable, near future. But you see, even though somebody did a survey and found an alarmingly high proportion of the population who claim, mind you, in a system that is authoritarian, when asked, do you support the president, they might fear that this is a provocation, and they best answer the way they're supposed to be answering. So I am not sure that we can believe these um, uh, surveys that have been done. And my hope is that, seeing the horrors that are being committed in their name, uh, those who manage to see it, because of course they are being hidden from them. They are being hidden from them. And the West really needs a radio-free Europe or something, a television-free Europe that shows them. Because when a BBC journalist went to visit an elderly lady in her apartment and asked her how she reacts to the news, she says, well, everything that is stated about Kharkiv being bombed by Russians is a terrible lie. Oh, how do you know that? Well, because he promised that he would not be bombing or doing anything of the kind. And if he said so, it must be so. Now, this admirably uncritical faith in a leader, is it an inheritance of a person who grew up in Soviet times, when you were told this is how things are and this is what you must believe and what you are told is it? How widespread is it among the educated, among the younger people? I fear that there is a significant portion who still actually do support their leader. But under situations of crisis, people can't switch their opinions. They can wake up when they had been half asleep, or drifting along and not paying attention. So I would say there is always hope. We should not give up on anybody, including on the Russian population.
I couldn't agree more. Of course, one of the important narratives or storylines related to this conflict, a more geopolitical narrative, is Ukraine's path to joining NATO and the EU, to achieving formal Euro-Atlantic integration. And you, of course, are in a unique position to speak about this, considering that, well, many would say that the crowning achievement of your tenure as president of Latvia was Latvia's accession to these organizations. Ukraine, of course, is attempting to do the same in far more difficult circumstances. It may sound self-evident, but could you perhaps tell me why joining these organizations was important for Latvian democracy? How did Latvia manage to seize this kind of window of opportunity?
I was elected in 1999, and Latvia regained its de facto independence after the August Putsch of 1991. So it had been really a relatively short time. And in that time, people had accepted that they did have now a free country, an independent country, but they also had to suffer, obviously, the economic consequences of a centralized and planned economy that had been failing for years, that had finally had collapsed. And the transition to capitalism was, for many people, sufficiently painful and imposed various hardships on them and disappointments, especially people who were close to retirement age. I remember talking to people close to retirement age, worrying about a small pension and so on and so on. The question was at the time, how are we to live in our new relationship with our neighbor, who immediately after our independence started attacking the former republics for a variety of reasons, looking for reproaches to make them. And President Putin had, in fact, a sort of notebook, and the Russian government had I think, a list of reproaches to make to former republics about how they are mistreating the Russian-speaking population that remained with them. And Latvia was a prime object because we had, among the three Baltic republics, we had the largest proportion of Russian speakers among our population. There had been 9% of ethnic Russians in Latvia in 1939. When independence came, the majority of the inhabitants of Riga, the capital, were Russian speakers. But I remember that when I had my first meeting with President Putin early in his presidency, he did not wish an official exchange of visits. We had to meet privately on neutral ground in Austria. And I was encouraged by business leaders and many politicians that we should make, with its new president of Russia, we should make every effort to be friendly, to show our openness, to convince them that we were not harming our Russian-speaking population. Quite the contrary, we were encouraging them to integrate into society, and so on and so forth. And at one point, he was, and I'm talking now about around 2000 or 2001, I forget the exact date, early 2001 possibly, I think the month of February. He was listing a whole series of wrongs that we were doing to our Russian speakers. And how he felt it was his duty to defend them and protect them. And I told him, Mr. President, when you are talking about your Russians in my country, may I correct you and remind you that the Russians living in Russia are your Russians. but the Russians living in Latvia are my Russians. And our government is actually responsible for looking after them. And seeing that we create a society, a multinational society, where one thing, however, is crucial in order to preserve the survival of the Latvian language, which had become seriously threatened under the Soviet rule. Latvian must be the only official language, and we cannot afford to have a bilingual country, but a multicultural one, of course. And by the way, among those your Russians that you claim as being under your protection, there are many people who are Russian speaking, but are not ethnic Russians. And I said, except for the president and her family, I think that just about 99% of Latvia's inhabitants are Russian speaking, because in Soviet times everybody had to be a Russian speaker. So when you talk about all the Russian speakers, it means everybody in Latvia practically. It's a meaningless term. If you're talking about ethnic Russians, we do not separate our citizens or our non-citizens, for that matter, in terms of their ethnic origin, but simply in terms of their readiness. Do they wish to become citizens of our country and to commit to it? And then pass a very easy language test, and learn an anthem that is only 2 strophes long, as opposed to the Marseillaise, which most Frenchmen don't know to the end, with requirements that I try to explain to him are really much more lenient than, for instance, the requirements for getting German citizenship, just elementary. For people who had come under a military occupation to our country, if they wish to stay in the country, they should go through a naturalization process. And during my time, I promised him that if he thought that we were, for instance, asking, there was a fee for registering for an application to citizenship. I said, if you think that the cost of a bottle of vodka for this application is too much, I will ask, when I return to Latvia, I will ask our Prime Minister to reduce that fee, if that is considered to be a barrier to them becoming citizens, because we would like them to become citizens.
You mentioned the list of kind of grievances that Russia had with Latvia or the Baltic states, but I think we can explore this more in a more contemporary context. It seems that countries in the West have seemingly woken up to the threat of Russian influence through foreign interference. High-profile inquiries have been launched in Washington, in London, in Brussels, in the European Parliament. As you said, however, the Baltic states have had a long track record of experience in dealing with foreign interference in its various forms, whether, for example, covert political funding, hostile disinformation, and so on. I would be interested in hearing your thoughts on the Baltic states' experience in dealing with the threat of foreign interference, and maybe what our partners in the West can learn from the Baltics in this regard.
Our experience has been that any crack or weakness in the fabric of society that the Russian secret services and their foreign service, which are very closely interlinked, anything of that sort that they can detect, they report back home, and then experts evaluate it, and they calibrate the possibility of using this crack to destabilize that society, to weaken that society. And the general philosophy is truly an evil one, because the aim is to do harm, which is what one does in wartime, granted. But you see, war, a state of war, a mental state of war, has never been abandoned by the leaders of Russia. Quite the contrary, I think the resentment that President Putin has openly expressed at the collapse of the Soviet Union, how unfair it is, how unacceptable, how humiliating. Humiliating to whom? to him as a leader with imperialistic and tsarist sort of pretensions? Obviously, yes. But otherwise, why should it be humiliating to somebody, say, living in Siberia, the fact that we have three republics, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, who have recovered their independence and wish to have their independence? They have this huge landmass at their disposal, huge natural resources. These are tiny countries who wish to go their way. In what way are they hurting, harming, threatening, endangering, or humiliating Russia? Absolutely in no rational way whatsoever, except in a sense of having shown the former empires of being forcefully uh, and unhappily received by the nations that were under the thumb of, be it the Tsarist regime or the Soviet regime, where, yes, many nations were brought under one umbrella, but in most cases, rather reluctantly so. With the exception, of course, of collaborators, because any system whatsoever will always have collaborators. That must be also remembered.
Also, continuing on the Baltic states experience, in your historic NATO Prague summit speech, you congratulated allies on their wisdom for accepting the Baltic states into NATO, of course, suggesting that the Baltic states are an asset to the alliance. Yet, in light of Russian aggression, both in 2014 and now, again in both in popular discourse, but also among Western pundits, there is this narrative that the Baltic states are an Achilles heel, a vulnerable sort of spot in Euro-Atlantic collective security. What is your assessment of these claims? Kind of, are the Baltic states purely security consumers, or have they shown to be capable security providers in areas such as cybersecurity, strategic communications, and so on?
They are like the canaries in a mine that will give you the first signals of danger coming from the east. And we have been doing so. We have been the singing canaries who have been telling the West about the dangers that we perceive, and we have been heard uh, more or less over the years by different leaders, by different governments, sometimes less, sometimes more, but on the whole, we were accepted. And I think I still maintain that it was a wise decision that the then 15 nations took. It's absolutely a brilliant decision that they took, because the space of democratic governance and of rule of law and of humanistic values on the whole. I'm not saying that every single citizen is a model citizen, or that our leaders are necessary philosophers' kings. You see all of them, and so on. But it is a democratic space, and look next doors. Look at Belarus under President Lukashenko. Nothing of the sort is to be seen in any of the former satellite countries of Central and Eastern Europe, or in the Baltic countries. We are far from perfect, but we certainly not failed states, as Mr. Putin would like the world to believe, and he convince himself that it is so.
Thank you for this. I think maybe one final question before we conclude would be a more big picture question. And considering your extraordinary international experience, it would be useful to ask about the state of democracy more globally. Of course, according to reports by different organizations like Freedom House or Amnesty International, bluntly put, democracy around the world is in retreat. Democratic institutions and civil rights this year deteriorated in more than 60 countries. It is abundantly clear that the optimism of the 90s is gone. Ideas about the end of history are gone. Democracy is on the defensive, and we see that in Ukraine. In your view, how should we approach international cooperation toward building democratic resilience?
The very concept of what democracy means, I think, is something that needs to be constantly evaluated and reevaluated, and the principles that underlie democratic systems should be taught to children starting in kindergarten. I think that what we have in our educational systems in many countries is maybe a course in civics at some point in high school or at the end of grade school. But the very principles of mutual respect and tolerance are what need to be taught starting in kindergarten. In theory, in principle, this is what has been going on for the last 100 years in many ways. There have been attempts, Pestalozzi in Switzerland with his ideas on education, Maria Montessori, and so on and so forth. Right now, I was part of an expert group under the aegis of UNESCO, who have just published a report about the futures of education, the way we see it as a sort of common good in society, a commons, just like the plot of grass in the center of the village where everybody can bring his cow to graze freely. Education is something that belongs to citizens, and they all should contribute to fostering it and making it accessible to everybody. The reasons for abandoning democracy are something that need to be evaluated in every country. I believe that there are significant differences and nuances for the reasons why people reject equality of citizens before the law, because that is the fundamental principle. And what are the barriers that prevent people from accepting every other human being or being of equal worth as I myself? That is truly what it's about. And if there are systemic aspects in the way societies are structured, if there are systemic aspects to either classes or groups of visibly recognizable subgroups of society being perceived as threatening or being used as scapegoats for the dissatisfactions and complaints that people have about their lives and their condition, every country needs to look at it very seriously. I think that we have been taking democracy for granted. Once established, forget about it. Just the routine just rolls on, and it is not so. It has to be watched, watered like a plant, like a flower. It needs to be fed. It needs light. It needs air. It needs attention. It needs our commitment and our understanding, a deep understanding of what it means to live in a democracy. I think that many people don't bother to think about it. Well, they should be at least taught in school so that for the rest of their lives, just like Mr. Putin's followers believe, if he says so, it is so. Well, we should be able to teach our future generations that certain principles of humanity, of respect for other human beings, they are just the second nature. They are as natural as breathing. And there's no question about them. But there is a question about it, and therefore we must think about it.
I think on this optimistic note, we can conclude. Madam President, you have given me, I would say, unlimited food for thought. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, Tom.
The pleasure was all mine.